In the previous video on Spring Security with OAuth2, we saw how we can integrate OAuth2 inside a Spring Boot application using Spring Security and how we can authorize and authenticate it using a in-memory authentication mechanism. In this particular video, we are going to use a database to authenticate your username and password. So what we are going to do is we are going to use a MySQL database which I have running in my machine, and we are going to use that particular database to authenticate yourself. Let's get started. Press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss any update from Tech Primers. You guys know that I have uploaded the OAuth2 project into GitHub, and I'm going to use the same project so that we can work on just modifying that project to make it work with the database, because I don't have to create the whole auth server again and then I don't have to re-explain and recreate everything from the beginning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the same project which we saw in the previous video where I had created the OAuth2 example with Spring Security. So what we did is we created two separate processes. So basically we created two microservices. One is called the auth server, the other was called the client. So what I have done is I've just checked out both of them separately in my local workspace. So I'm going to show you how you can modify the auth server to make it connect to the MySQL database and using the client. So I have the project downloaded, so you can also work on that, and also I will upload this new project as well into a new repository so that you can have a reference, right? So that I don't have to recode that. That's why I'm just reusing the same project. So if you notice here in the previous project, we had this in-memory authentication, right? What we are going to do is we are going to eliminate this in-memory authentication and we are going to use the MySQL authentication. So for that what we need to do is we need to remove this particular piece where we said okay, we are going to use in-memory authentication. Instead I'm going to use the user details service. So if you have seen my video on Spring Security, the basic Spring Security with the MySQL authentication, this might be familiar because Spring as a framework provides something called user details service, which you can use for changing the way you authenticate stuff. So in our case we are going to use the database, so we are going to create a custom user detail service. So let's see how we can do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say custom user detail service, right? And we need to create this user detail service, so which is nothing but an interface, right? We need to implement that interface and then we need to work on it. So I'll just auto wire this and I need to create a service, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a package which is called service. So I'm going to create a Java class which is going to called as custom user details service, right? And I need to implement the interface user detail service. Okay, I'll just rename this to user details service, right? So I'll rename the object details service as well, right? Okay, so I need to implement the methods. So there will be only one method, which is the load user detail, and also I'm just going to annotate it with a service because this is the service which I have created here, right? So let's fill in this later. So before that we need to create some models, right? So we need some models. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the similar concept which we did in the Spring Security MySQL database authentication, which is just the plain Spring Security with the database. So I'm going to use a similar model. So what we need to do is in order to use this custom user detail service, we need to override the user details, right? So I'm going to create that model and I'm going to override. So let me do that. So I'm going to create the Java class called user custom user detail, and I'm going to extend this from the users, right? So this is users. I'm going to create it now, and I'll implement this from the user details, which is provided by Spring. So let's implement the stuff which are provided by Spring, right? You see lots of these. Now let me create the users. right? Before that, let's go to that. Let's go to the custom user detail and let's finish this off, right? So I need to add a, so let me minimize this, right? So I need to add the constructor here. So what I will do is I'll just add a default constructor. I don't need the default constructor though, but I need to um, provide the list of users, right, who I need to pass it to the users. It's a basically a user, but still I have made it as user, so I'll just create a constructor there, right? So then we need an object called model role, right? So we need something called role we need to assign the role for the users. So I'm going to create a model called role so that we can use it. And let's use the JPA, Spring JPA to persist. So I have not integrated Spring JPA into this project, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the dependency and add the JPA. So I'm going to add the dependency called Spring Boot Starter JPA, and also I'm going to add the dependency for MySQL Java connectivity. So MySQL connector Java. So this should integrate me into this Spring JPA, right? So we're going to use Spring JPA to persist into the MySQL database, because we need to persist, not persist, basically we need to retrieve the data from the database, right? So that's why I'm using this. And also I'll just show you the database. So let me show the database structure so that you have an idea before I create the model, right? So the database has a table called role, which has the role ID and the role. So what is the role ID? The role ID is a number, and then the role is admin. And there is a table called user. It has user ID. It says whether it's active or not. Then it has an email address, then the last name, first name, and the password, right? For now I have not encrypted or done anything, just for our reference, right? I'm not going to encrypt anything, but you can do the encryption by yourself, right? The next one is the user roles. So I'm just going to provide what role is associated with what user. So user ID is coming from here and the role is coming from here, and this is the joining table, basically the normalized table, which is going to say that this particular user has this particular role. Okay, so that is the basic structure. So we need to create this user role and user underscore role, right? So if you had seen my previous video, you will be familiar with this particular model, because it's the same model I'm going to use. It's the same table I'm going to use. I'm going to use the entity JP entity, and I'm going to make it as a table. And what is the table name? Table name is the role, right? That's what we created. Also I'm going to create the role ID, that is what we did. Then we need the role, basically, which is what type of role it is, whether it is a admin or user or something like that. And this is an ID. We need to generate this, so I'm going to say generated value. The strategy for this should be auto, right? Let it create automatically. And I need to map this to the column which says role underscore ID, right? That's what we had in the database. Okay, so this is the Spring JPA notation. That's what I have done. So for the role table, I'm going to say the table name, the column name should be role. Okay, so I'm going to add some constructor. I'm just going to add default constructor for Hibernate, and I'm going to add some getters and setters, right? I think done. So we don't need anything else, right? So what we have done here is we have just created a role model, and then we have added it with annotations which Spring JPA requires. Now we are coming to the users. So users, the table name which we had was user, right? So I'm going to annotate it with the name user so that it maps to the user table. So this by default now will map to the user table, and there were different fields, right? So we need to write all those fields. So one is the ID, the next one is the email address, the next is string name, private string password, and also last name. And we had a active as well, right? Last name. We also had an active, whether it said the user is active or not, right? And I need to annotate it these same way: ID, generate value, right? And strategy should be auto, right? And the column name is user underscore id, right? That's what we created there. So the next one is the email. Email had the name email. The next one is the name. Name had the name, so we can do this. And the next one, the name was password, so I'm just typing password. Same way, the next one was last name, so I'm just saying last underscore name. And the last one was active, right? It said active. Now there was a intermediate table which was having a relationship, right? So what we are going to do is we are going to use the one-to-many mapping and map that relationship here itself, so that whenever you load a user, it gives you the roles for that particular user. So we are going to leverage that one-to mapping feature for from the Spring JPA using Hibernate. So I'm going to say give me the set of roles, right, of this particular user. So I'm going to say roles, and what we need to do is we need to join this with the table, right? You have to do join table, right? And what column do we need to do, right? You have to join the table, which is the table name. Sorry, the table name should be user underscore role, right? Wait, let's check once. The table name is user underscore role. You have to join the user underscore role table with the columns. So you need to say join columns, okay? And I'm going to say join the column. The name of the column is user underscore id from ours, right? Okay, and I'm going to say now how do you do inverse join, right? So now I am saying that do a inverse join of the role underscore id, right? So what I have done is I have just joined these two using the user id column from this particular table to the role id from the other table, right? That's what I have done here. Okay, and this is nothing but a one-to-many relationship because one user can have many roles, right? That's why you have a set of roles. So I'm going to say one-to-many, and I need this particular data, right, by default. So I'm going to say cascade. The type of cascade is cascade, and I'm going to say fetch me by eager. So by default it's eager, but just I want to mention so that we know it's getting the data by default. Okay, that's all I guess. I'm going to add a dummy constructor for Hibernate, and we have a constructor here, so we need to assign the variables, right? So I'm going to say active equal to users dot, we are basically just copying the data from one user to the current user. Okay, that's what this is going to do. So email equal to users dot email to users dot id. I'm just going to type this. So I'm just going to assign everything from the user object to the current object. Okay, is there anything else? And I think that's it. Equal to users dot role, right? Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the getters and setters basically. So I'm going to say getters and setters. Okay, that's all. So our model is ready. Now the users model is ready. From this users model we have extended this guy, right? So that we can reuse it in the custom user details, so that Spring can reuse them if it is required, right? However, if you notice here we have not populated any value here. Let's do that now, right? So we have called the super, so that is going to just clone the objects. Now I'm going to use the password, so username should be super dot get name, password should be super. So this super is nothing but the coming from the users, that's why we added the super, right? Is account non-expired true, I'm going to make it as true. Is account non-locked true, and is credential non-expiring true, and is enabled true. Okay, by default I'm going to enable everything is true, right? Now we need to populate the granted authority, so we need the roles. So in order to get the roles, what we need to do, we get the roles, however it has a different type, right? So we need to convert this into a list. So I'm just going to do a stream, and I'm going to convert this. So since I need to convert, I'm going to use the map. So what is there inside the role? It's a role. Okay, I'm just going to use the lambda expression. So I'm just saying create a new simple granted authority. Okay, using the role. So role underscore, that is the general notation which Spring requests, and then I'm going to say get me role dot get role, right? That's what we need. We don't need the ID, but we need the role. And finally, I'm just going to, since we have multiple roles, I'm just going to convert this into a list. So collectors dot to list, right? And we can, in fact, we can even directly return this. Okay, so we created a simple granted authority with the roles which we got from the database, which got populated into the user. So since we get the data from the database, we need to create a repository which is not there right now. So I'm going to create a package. So let me create a package called repository, and I'm going to create a class called users repository, right? And this is going to be an interface. In fact, it's going to be extending from the JPA repository, and the object which we have is the users, and the ID is an integer, right? So that's what. So we are done here, right? However, we did not populate the service, correct? So we had the service, we did not populate the service. So let's do the population of the service, right? So what do we need to do here? So we have the load users by username method. So what is going to come here is the username. So we are going to get the username first, and we are going to use this username to get the data from the database. So in order to get the data from the database, we need to get that data, right? So I'm going to use the auto wire, and then I'll just say give me the users repository, and I'll get it from that users repository, right? So user repository dot find by. So we did not create any find by. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a find by name, because name is the name of the username in the database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a find by name, right? And there could be chances that this could be present or might not be present. So this can be an optional field. So optional is a concept where you it's like a wrapper around an object, so that you can use it for controlling. So I have an optional object here, right? So this particular optional object, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this object. So let me just create a variable called users optional. So this is the users optional. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say users optional if the value is not present. So what I need to do, right? If the value is not present, I'm going to throw an exception saying username not found exception, because that's what this particular method throws, right? So I'm going to throw this particular exception saying that username not found, right? Okay, this got changed, I don't know why. Username not found exception. Okay, so that's what we have done here. Okay, the other thing is I don't want to do the map here. I wanted to get the value from that particular user. So let's say if the user is not there, we will throw an exception. If the user is there, what do we need to do, right? If the user is there, let's map that particular user and retrieve the value from the user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say convert this particular user, right? to a custom user detail. Custom user, sorry, what is that name? Custom user detail, right? Yeah, custom user details. And I'm going to pass this users there. So this is why we created this particular constructor here, so that we can pass it and then we can reuse that, so that it is of type user and of type the user detail, so that Spring can use it. So if you see here, Spring needs a user details, and this particular object is of type user details here. That is why we had to implement this particular method, and we reuse the users. So we had the users from the database, and we just are converting from the users to the custom users, and then finally we are going to get that particular value, so that it returns the user detail, right? So let me, in fact we can replace this with the reference method reference, right? I think that's it. Okay, if it is not present, it would have thrown an exception. If it is present, it just maps the particular object into a custom user detail, and then it just gets that particular object and then returns it to Spring Framework. So how Spring Framework is going to use it is from here. So using the custom details service which we auto wired here, Spring Framework is going to use that and then use this method, called the load user by username, and then it is going to get the values from the database. Okay, so I think we are done. So what do we need to do? What else we need to do? So yeah, we need to add the properties, the MySQL properties. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add the MySQL properties here. I just added a live template already, so that I can just reuse it. So I just added the properties here in one shot. Okay, apart from that, we don't have to do anything, right? That's it, because we have just changed only the part where the authentication is changing. That is why we had to change only this part in the authorization server config. In the client side, we don't have to do any change. So this is the client side where we have a HTML page which is hosted under /UI. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this server. I think I have already started this. Let me restart it. I had this already starting, but let me restart it. Meanwhile, I will start our server here, right? So I'm going to start the authorization server as well, so that this can be contacted from the client side, and we can see whether the authentication is happening or not using OAuth2. So the port, let me see the port which this is coming up in, right? The client I think might be coming up at 8082. Okay, so I'm going to use localhost 8082 8082/UI, right? So this is where our UI is hosted. Yep, our UI is up. So the client is up. Let's see if the server is up. Once the server is up, let's hit the um, login, so that we can log into the server. Okay, so what is happening here is the client is going to use the authorization server to authenticate ourselves using the database information. So let's see what initially, if you remember, we had the in-memory detail called Peter and Peter. The username is Peter and the password is Peter. We are going to try that first to check if it is still using the in-memory database. Then we will see how we can connect to the new username and password which is there in the database. So the server is using 8081 if you notice, and it is up right now. So I'm going to click on the login to auth here, and this is going to redirect to the Spring login page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Peter and Peter, right? This was the login which we had already, right? Let's see what happens. If you notice here, we got an error saying your login attempt was not successful. Let me try without a password. What is happening? Yep, the same error came. Now I'm going to use the username and the password from the database. So Sam is the username and Sam is the password. Let me try that. Right, I'm going to try this. Hopefully this should take me to the secure page. Yep, if you notice here, the URL got changed, and this is directly it has directly taken us to the client side, however with a secured URL, right? And it is saying that, okay, welcome to Tech Primers Sam. Okay, and this is a secured page, right? So let's check if it really did the database query. And yep, if you see here, these are the Hibernate queries which we saw, right? These are the logs from the Hibernate. So it is directly querying the database, and it is directly getting the user roles and the password from there, right? So this is how you can integrate the database inside the OAuth2 inside the Spring Security framework, right? So what I'll just summarize what we did again so that you have a brief understanding of what is it. So if you want to know the whole complete OAuth setup with inside the Spring Boot project, there is a separate video. Go and check it out. You can just check it out in the suggested link. So once the video is completed, if you want to go there, I'll just provide the link there. You can just go and check out how you can create it. However, this video is just the continuation of that so that you can integrate the database authentication for the OAuth2. So what we did here is we just added the user detail service here. So what we did is we had the authentication manager. Inside the authentication manager, we added the user detail service. This user detail service is the one which is going to act as a customization inside the Spring Security framework, so that you can use the you can use the MySQL database. And in order to override this particular user detail service, I have created a custom user detail service, right, which is a service, and I have implemented that particular interface. The only method in the interface is the load user by username. This is the method which we can override, and we can do whatever we want and return the user details object finally after we have authenticated. So what we have done here is we are just using the username and password, and then we are authenticating it. So we got the username and password, and then we are giving the user by converting it into the custom user details object. Okay, how we are getting the data from the database? We are using the user repository using the Spring JPA framework, and we have the model created which is called users. So this is the table structure which we have in the database. Same way role is another one, right? And we are going to override the custom user details. So this is needed because if you notice here in the custom detail service, you need a user detail object, right, which is nothing but a model. So in order to use that model, we are overriding that particular interface, and then we are implementing the methods which are used by Spring. Along with that, we have the users model here, right? And we got the roles, and then we converted them into a simple granted authority, and then we are providing it into the Spring framework itself using the get authorized authorities. Okay, apart from that, what we have done is we have just added the properties for the database connection. This is my database connection details which I am using locally, and also in the POM XML we added some dependencies. The first one was for the JPA integration. We are using the Spring Data JPA, so this is the dependency, and the next one is the MySQL connector injection. So this is required for connecting to the MySQL database. If you are using a HSQL database or any other H2 or any in-memory database, you can just add that dependency, and that should get automatically auto-wired by Spring Boot, right? So that is what we did as a part of this particular video. So we just created integration with the Spring Security. We modified the custom user details and stuff so that we can use database for authenticating our user using the OAuth2, right? And the client side, we didn't do any change because we have not changed anything from our client, right, this time. Okay, so that's from this particular video. That's what I wanted to cover as a part of this particular video. Hope you liked it. If you have any questions, queries, do drop that in the comment section below. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, do subscribe to it. If you are new to the channel, do share this particular channel to whoever is using Spring Boot or DevOps or anything which is new in the microservices world, right? Meet you again in the next video. Thank you very much.